This week's Torah reading is called Pekudei, which means counts. The main subject, basically, is the Jewish people actually doing with their hands, etc., the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, and the presence of God residing on top of it in a cloud, etc., that gives room to the next book of the Torah, because this is the end of the second book of the Torah. And the next one, it's God talking to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses, giving him all kinds of instructions for the priests, the Koyanim, and all kinds of other things related to Korbanos, offerings. Now, there's a famous question, so to speak, regarding this particular reading and the previous one, Vayakhel. When you actually look at them, it's just a repetition, basically a repetition of previous sections in the Torah. You have Trumah and Tetzaveh. Trumah literally means donations. Tetzaveh means command. And then Ki Tisa, when you count, etc. These three sections of the Torah actually talk about exactly the same subject: how to build the Mishkan, all the parts of the Tabernacle, how to actually do the clothes, the garments of the priests. And then you go back to Vayakhel, the previous one, and this one. It talks about how the Jewish people did it. Why does the Torah repeat in so many verses exactly the same ideas? And they did this, and they did that, and they did... Just say, they did as God commanded Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's it. With one verse, you can actually summarize two parshas, two sections of the Torah. So, if the Torah writes this down, it's because the Torah is trying to teach us something specifically, that there's a very important lesson in this doing it again. So I'm going to explain this question in two different realms. The Torah can be learned in many realms, so to speak. Some realms are called pshat. Pshat means the simple meaning of things. Don't come to me with teachings and lessons and strange ideas and connections. No. Just explain to me the simple meaning of things. That's called pshat. And then there are other realms of understanding Torah which are deeper, where you look for lessons, when you're looking for the background, what's going on in the story, what Moshe told God, and God answered Moshe, and so on. So I'm going to explain in basically two realms. First of all, pshat, simple meaning. We find that when God really, really likes and appreciates something, He lets certain repetitions appear in the Torah, showing actually that He actually likes this thing. Where do we see this? When we go back, really back, in the previous book of the Torah, Parashat Sarah. In Parashat Sarah, the subject of the parsha is the passing away of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and Eliezer, the slave of Abraham, going to Haran to find a wife for the son of his master Yitzchak, and so on. And we find that the whole story, which I'm not going to go back to it now, but the whole story is basically repeated two times, or even you can say three times in the Torah. Wait a second, we're talking about a story of a marriage, basically. Why does it have to be repeated in Torah? Because the Torah says, actually, our sages explain, that is much better the talk of the slaves of our forefathers, in this case Eliezer, Eved Avraham, the slave of Avraham, that's more choviv, that's the word in Hebrew, which means more cherished by God, than actually the Torah of the sons, the children. The children are we are the children, that God gave us the Torah, the Jewish people, etc. And we have Torah, and we learn, and we understand, and Mount Sinai and everything. You know what? It's much better the repetition of the Eved, the slave of our forefathers, that talk, that's the way it's called, sicha, talk in Hebrew, that's much more cherished by God than our Torah. This means, again, that when God cherishes something, we see certain repetitions in the Torah. That brings us to our question: why is a repetition between the Parshas Trumah, Tetzaveh, Ki Tisa, and Vayakhel Pekudei? Because God cherishes the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. Because the Tabernacle means that God actually forgave the sin of the golden calf that the Jewish people did right after the giving of the Torah, etc., 40 days after. That means that God forgave. God wants to dwell within us, between us. That's why it's a cherished thing, and that's why it's repeated. This is the pshat. This is the way of the simple meaning of the Torah. Now let's go a little bit deeper. A different realm of the Torah. When we analyze Trumah, Tetzaveh, Ki Tisa against Vayakhel Pekudei, we find many differences. Point number one, in Trumah Tetzaveh and Ki Tisa, is God talking, and to whom is he talking? To Moshe Rabbeinu. We're talking about God, of course, the highest of the highest. And he's talking to the highest prophet that ever was in the face of the earth, Moshe Rabbeinu. And he's saying to him, telling him instructions in Mount Sinai, what to do with the Mishkan, with the Tabernacle, etc., etc. So we're talking about the highest of the highest. Both the giver of the instructions, the receiver of the instructions, the praise of the instructions, etc. That's Trumah Tetzaveh and Ki Tisa. But when you go to Vayakhel and Pekudei, you find differently. You find Moshe Rabbeinu talking to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people actually doing these instructions that Moshe Rabbeinu gave. That means that there's a huge, maybe infinite difference between what the first three parshas talk about and the next two, so to speak, Vayakhel and Pekudei talk about. One is in potential, and the other one is the reality of action, of doing, actually construction of the tabernacle. When does God reside within the Jewish people and the cloud of God reveals itself, etc., etc.? When you actually do things in reality, in a material world. This has a very powerful lesson. We might have very good intentions. We might have very good feelings and thoughts and everything. The main thing in the Torah is action. Main thing in Judaism is go do kindness to your friends. Don't just think good about them. It also that, of course, it's a good thing to think good things about others because that awakens within others good things. But the main thing is action. That's why we find a apparent repetition, which is actually not repetition. Something is in power, bekoyach, that's why it's called in Hebrew, a possibility of God talking to Moses, very nice. But you know what? The main thing, the way that God resides in this earth within us is when we actually do kindness, we do good things the way the will of God actually wants.